We gave Melvin 2 rooms at the back of the hospital. One room was a bathroom, so he could have a bath every day. Soon his skin was much better, and there was no horrible smell. The second room had a bed, table, and chairs. I visited him every day, and talked to him. He loved reading, and talking about books. At first he did not know many books, the Bible, and 1 or 2 newspapers, that's all. But I gave him some books of love stories, and he liked them very much. He read them again and again, and talked about them often. For him, the men and women in these books were alive, like you and me. He was very happy. But sometimes it was difficult for him. At first, 1 or 2 people in the hospital laughed at Melvin because he was ugly. Sometimes, they brought their friends to look at him. One day a new nurse came to the hospital, and nobody told her about Melvin. She took his food to his room, and opened the door. Then she saw him. She screamed, dropped the food on the floor, and ran out of the room. I was very angry with the nurse, and went to see Melvin. He was not happy about it, but he was not very angry. I think he felt sorry for the girl. People don't like looking at me. I know that, Dr. Henry, he said. They usually laugh or scream. Well, I don't want nurses to laugh at you, John, I said angrily. I want them to help you. Thank you, doctor, he said, in his strange slow voice. But it's not important. Everyone laughs at me. I understand that. I looked at him sadly. In his one good hand, his left hand, he had the little picture of his mother. He looked at the picture for a minute, and then put it by a flower on the table. A tear ran out of his eye and down the skin of his enormous, ugly face. Dr. Henry, he said, slowly. You and the nurses are very kind, and I'm very happy here. Thank you very much. But I know I can't stay here long, and I would like to live in a lighthouse, after the hospital, please. A lighthouse, or a home for blind people. I think those are the best places for me. What do you mean? I asked. Why? He did not look at me. He put the flower on the picture and looked at it carefully. Lighthouses have sea all round them, don't they? He said. Nobody could look at me in a lighthouse, so I would be happy there. And blind people can see nothing, so they couldn't see me, could they? But John, I said, this is your home. You live here now. You aren't going to leave the hospital. Not today, perhaps, he said. But soon. You're a kind man, Dr. Henry. But I can't stay here very long. I have no money. I smiled. John, I said. This is your home now. Don't you understand? You can stay here all your life. Very carefully, I told him about the letter to the Times, and the money. I don't think he understood at first, so I told him again. He was very quiet for a minute. Then he stood up, and walked up and down the room very quickly. A strange sound came from him, like laughing. I did not want Melvin to live by himself, like a man in a lighthouse. He read his books, and talked to me, but I wanted him to talk to more people. And I wanted him to talk to women. Melvin read about women in his books, but he did not often talk to women. He met the nurses every day, but they did not talk to him very much. For them, he was always a creature, not a man. One day, one of my friends, a beautiful young woman, came to the hospital. I told her about Melvin, and took her to his room. She opened the door, and smiled at him. "Good morning, Mr. Melvin," she said. Then she shook his hand. Melvin looked at her for a minute with his mouth open. Then he sat down on his bed, with his head in his hand, and cried. He cried for nearly 5 minutes. The tears ran down his face, between his fingers, and onto the floor. My friend sat on the bed beside him and put her hand on his arm. She said nothing, but she smiled at him and shook his hand again before she left. "Dr. Henry," he said to me that night. "That lady was wonderful. My mother smiled at me once, many years ago, but no women smile at me now. But this lady smiled at me too, and she shook my hand. A beautiful lady smiled at me and shook my hand." My young lady friend came again the next week, and talked to Melvin for half an hour. The week after that, she came again with a friend. They gave him some books, and had a cup of tea with him. It was wonderful for him. For the first time in his life, he had some friends. He was a very happy man. He sat in his room, and read his books, and said no more about living on a lighthouse. People began to read about Melvin in the newspapers, so he had a lot of visitors. Everybody wanted to see him. A lot of important ladies and gentlemen visited him. They smiled at him, shook his hand, and gave him books. Melvin liked talking to these people, and he began to forget about his ugly body. His visitors never laughed at him. He began to feel like a man, not a creature. One wonderful day, a very important lady came to the hospital to visit him. I met the lady, and took her to his room. Then I opened the door, and smiled at him. "Good morning, John," I said. "There is a new visitor to see you today. A very famous lady." Melvin stood up beside his table. He did not smile, because his face could not smile, but his eyes looked happy. "That's good," he said. "Who is it?" I moved away from the door, and the visitor walked in. "Your Majesty, this is John Melvin," I said. "John, this is Her Majesty, Queen Leah, the Queen of Huntingdon." Queen Leah smiled at him. "How do you do, Mr. Melvin?" she said. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Then she shook his hand. Melvin did not move. For nearly half a minute he stood and looked at her with his mouth open. Then he spoke, in his strange, slow voice. How do you do, Your Majesty?" he said. But I don't think the Queen understood him, because he tried to get down on his knees at the same time. It was very difficult for him, because of his enormous legs. "No, please, Mr. Melvin, do get up," said the Queen. "I would like to talk to you. Can we sit at your table?" Yes, of course," he said. They sat at the table. She took his left hand, the good hand, in hers. She looked at the hand carefully, and then smiled at Melvin again. "I often read about you in the newspapers," she said. "You are a very interesting man, Mr. Melvin. You have a very difficult life, but people say you're happy. Is it true? Are you happy now?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty, yes," said Melvin. "I'm a very happy man. I have a home here now, and friends, and my books. I'm happy every hour of the day." "What a wonderful story," she said. "I'm very pleased to hear it. Now, tell me about your reading. I see you have a lot of books here." "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. I love my books," said Melvin. And for nearly half an hour they sat and talked about books. The Queen gave him a little book, and some red flowers, before she left. After her visit, Melvin began to sing. He could not sing easily, of course, because of his mouth, but all that day there was a strange, happy noise in his room. He looked at the flowers carefully, and put them on his table. He had many visits from the Queen, and at Christmas she sent him a Christmas card. The present was a picture of Queen Leah, with her name on it. Melvin cried over it, and put it carefully by the bed in his room. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to the Queen. It was the first letter of his life. The Huntingdon Hospital. 24 RD Nov 1887. My dear Queen. Thank you very, very much for your wonderful card and the beautiful picture. It is best thing in my room, the very best, The most beautiful thing I have. This is the first Christmas present. Perhaps I had a Christmas with my mother once, but I do not remember it. I have my mother's picture too, and she is beautiful, like you. But now I know many famous ladies and kind people like you. But Dr. Henry, and I am a very happy man. I am happy too because I am going to see you in New Year. Happy Christmas to you, my dear friend. With all my love, John Melvin. Melvin had a lot of friends now, but he was more like a child than a man. He could read about things, and talk to his visitors, but he could not go out of the hospital by himself. He thought and played like a child. After Christmas, he wanted to go to the theater. This was very difficult, because I did not want the people in the theater to see him. But a kind lady from the theater, Mrs. Kendall, helped us. We bought tickets for a box at the side of the theater. We went to the theater in a cab with dark windows, and we went into the theater by a door at the back, the Queen's door. Nobody saw us. 3 nurses sat at the front of the box, and Melvin and I sat in the dark behind them. Nobody in the theater could see us, but we could see the play. It was a children's Christmas play. Melvin loved it. It was a most wonderful, exciting story. Often he laughed, and sometimes he tried to sing like the children in the theater. He was like a child. For him, everything in the story was true. Once he was very afraid, because the bad man in the play was angry and had a knife. At first Melvin wanted to leave the theater, but I stopped him. Then he was very angry with this bad man in the play. He hit his hand on his chair, and stood up and talked to the man. But nobody heard him. When the bad man went to prison, Melvin laughed. Melvin thought the beautiful young lady in the play was wonderful. He wanted to talk to her too. At the end of the play he was very happy because she married a good young man. He remembered this play for a long time, and he talked a lot about the people in it. "What do you think they did after we left?" he asked me. "Where do the young lady and the young man live? What are they doing now?" "I don't know," I said. "Perhaps they live in the country." Melvin thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "Dr. Henry, can I go to the country, please? I saw the country once from a train, but I never went there. I often read about it in books. It's very beautiful, isn't it? I would like to see it." The visit to the theater was difficult, but a visit to the country was more difficult. But again, one of his new friends helped us. She had a small house in the country, and Melvin could stay in it for the summer, she said. I took Melvin to the country in a train with dark windows, so nobody could see him. Then we went in a cab to the country house. There were a lot of trees near the house, but no people lived near it. A countryman brought food to the house every day, but no people came near it. I stayed with him that night. At night, it was very dark and quiet. In the morning, hundreds of birds sang in the trees, and everything outside the house was green. Melvin walked under the big trees, looking at things happily, and singing his strange song. I went back to Huntington, but Melvin stayed there for 6 weeks. He was wonderfully happy. Every week, he wrote me a letter. Apple Tree House, West Wickham, Berkshire. 19th of June 1888. Dear Drive Henry, I had a wonderful day again today. It was very warm, so I walked under the trees and sat by a stream. The water in the stream made a beautiful noise, like singing. Did you know that? I listened to it for 2 hours. Lots of little birds came near me. One had a red body in front, and a brown back. I gave it some bread, and it sat on my hand. A lot of birds are my friends now. I watched the fish in the stream, too. They were very exciting, because they moved very fast. 1 minute they were there, and the next minute I couldn't see them. But I waited quietly, and they always came back. I put my hand in the water, but I couldn't touch them. I met a big dog yesterday. It made a very loud noise, But I was not afraid. I sat down quietly and looked at it, and it came and smelt my hand. I saw it again today, and gave it some bread. It likes me now. I am going to put some flowers from the country in this letter. There are hundreds of flowers here. Did you know that? I like the little blue ones best, but they are all beautiful. I have lots of them in my room. I give them water every morning. Little flowers are very thirsty, you know. I am very happy here, Doctor, but I want to see you again soon, too. With love from your friend, John Melvin. At the end of the summer he came back to Huntingdon. He was very well, and his skin looked much better. He talked about the country a lot, but he was happy to see his friends and his books again, too. I am going to put some flowers from the country in this letter. There are hundreds of flowers here. Did you know that? I like the little blue ones best, but they are all beautiful. I have lots of them in my room. I give them water every morning. Little flowers are very thirsty, you know. I am very happy here, Doctor, but I want to see you again soon, too. With love from your friend, John Melvin. At the end of the summer he came back to Huntingdon. He was very well, and his skin looked much better. He talked about the country a lot, but he was happy to see his friends,